How many of y'all been out on the water this summer? Wow, that was more than I was expecting. Y'all probably are better familiar with lakes than I am, because I've not actually been out on a boat this summer, but lakes have a lot of power to do good, bad, to be fun, to be destructive, and maybe you end up like this. Anybody ever had a wake flip you over? You're paddling in a canoe, and all of a sudden somebody zips by in the water, and all of a sudden y'all know this? Your canoe just starts going up and down and up and down, and if you're not careful, you end up in a position kind of like that. Now that's one thing that can happen in waves. For your reference, if you're paddling a canoe, you're supposed to turn into the wave, turn and face it, and it will not be over. That's your canoe taking that. Some of you may end up more like this. Anybody do any of this summer? How about right side up? Any water skiing, any wakeboarding? How about y'all over here? Any tubing behind the boat? Anybody? You did some? Did you go tubing? All right, so there's some places where there'll be signs that say no wake. And it's saying, don't go fast, don't make a wave here, because you might knock over that person in the canoe, or you might destroy some of the vegetation and the plants around there. And so the lakes do a lot of different things. Some of them are good, some of them are fun, some of them can be destructive if we don't know how to respond to them. And so we're talking today about worshiping in the wake of children, with the idea being that having kids in worship changes things. It's a different kind of picture. We're going to be looking at a lot of different things that happen, but one of the ones that came to my mind was this. There are what are called phosphorescent algae out in the ocean. And sometimes when a boat is going through the ocean at night, it'll churn these up, and there'll be this incredible trail of glowing little plants. This is a picture of the shoreline. Now I've actually seen this one time when we were out in California, and we went to someone's house, and these algae were breaking on the shoreline, and so it wasn't a lake, but it was the waves turning over. And it was just this incredible glowing sensation that came because the water was turned up. If it had been calm, you never would have seen it. And so the challenge for us is to figure out how do we find the beauty and find the best, so that what we're doing looks like this, or maybe it looks like this for those of you who are on the adventurous side, and it doesn't look so much like this, because that's no fun for anybody. So I want to read to you today from Matthew 21, and this is a story that will be familiar to some of you, I suspect, about Jesus coming into Jerusalem. All right, now for those of you down here working on the banner, I want you all to listen to the story, and I want you to see if you can draw something on here that ties to the story, okay? Y'all got it? Okay. So this is Jesus coming into Jerusalem. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there, with her colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. "Say to daughter Zion, see, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." So the disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt, and they placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread out their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And the crowds went ahead of him, and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest heaven!" When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowds answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." Jesus then entered the temple courts and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. The blind and the lame came to him at the temple, and Jesus healed them. But when the chief priests and the teachers of the law saw the wonderful things Jesus did, and the children shouting in the temple courts, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. Do you hear what these children are saying? They asked him. Yes, replied Jesus. Have you never read, from the lips of children and infants, you, Lord, have called forth praise. And so we have this great story that we read just before Easter on what we call Palm Sunday of Jesus entering Jerusalem in this great celebration. But sometimes we miss the fact that Jesus goes on from there into the temple. And he drives out the money changers and drives out those who were selling the animals for the sacrifices. And at that moment, there's a division. The children, alongside the blind and the lame, they come to Jesus. While the rest of us have a tendency of saying, whoa, this is getting a little too much for me. And we take a step back. And we take a step away. And so, what I want to look at today is some of the things that we can learn from the children's willingness to worship in that moment. So, your first sermon note is this. Children were willing to worship Jesus when others were saying, this is ridiculous. We don't sometimes miss this picture, but Jesus comes into town riding on a baby donkey. His feet were probably just about dragging on the ground. And everybody's saying, hey, here comes a king. Now, they'd seen kings come into town before. And kings don't come in riding on a baby donkey. Kings come in riding on, I don't know, what do you think? A horse? Horsey? What else? What else might a king ride on? What do you think, Vic? A dragon. That would be a king's procession, wouldn't it? Now, for those of you who remember Aladdin, Genie decides Aladdin needs something special because he's coming in as a prince, right? He goes through all these different things. He tries like a 66 Camaro, and that ain't going to work. And then he tries a camel and a horse. And finally he decides on an elephant because that is going to make an impression, right? Riding an elephant. And that was what kings wanted to do when they had a procession. But Jesus finds the smallest and the weakest animal to ride in on. And anybody who's seen these kings process would say, that's ridiculous. This isn't a king. But we know that Jesus, he wasn't interested in whether we thought he looked like a king. He was interested in showing us a new way for him to be king. A king who reigns out of weakness, not out of strength. And so, in the midst of this ridiculous scene, it's the children who stick with this song, Hosanna. Hosanna. Your second sermon note is this. Children were willing to worship Jesus when others were running away from a Messiah who stood against injustice. We have this picture in the temple courts where instead of it being a place of prayer and a place of worship, they had turned the outer courts, the place where non-Jewish people were supposed to be able to worship, they turned it into a marketplace. And Jesus says, no, this isn't how God has called us to be. We're called to be people who worship. We are called to be people who seek God. We're not going to be taking advantage of one another. We're not going to be taking space that is supposed to be for worship and turning it into a place to make money. And so as Jesus does this, he turns over the tables, he drives these people out, and the good church folk get scared off. Because, wow, this is radical. This is different. He's upsetting the way we do church. And yet, in that moment, there was something about Jesus that the children were attracted to because they recognized his heart, they recognized his love, and they recognized why he was doing what he was doing. It wasn't because he was a violent person, but it was because he wanted people to be able to see God. As part of that, we see the children were willing to worship Jesus when others were silent for fear of what the people around them might think. This is a story we see come up often in the Gospels, especially in John's Gospel. We see Jesus does something, and then there's the Pharisees or the other religious establishment people who are saying, we don't like Jesus. We don't support him. And then they'll come up to somebody and say, well, what do you think? There's a story in John 9 about a man who had been born blind. We don't know how old he is, but he had been born blind and Jesus healed him. And the Pharisees go to Jesus' parents and they say, Jesus goes to his parents and he says to them, what do you think of Jesus? Good answer. He said, good. The parents said, we don't know, because they were afraid, because they knew the people asking them questions didn't like Jesus. They said, we don't know, ask our son. He's old enough, he can answer for himself. Technically they said he's of age, which means he was 13. So basically they're passing it off, they're saying, I don't want to answer because I might get in trouble. Talk to my son. He's at least 13. He can answer that question. The son says he's a prophet. And he gets thrown out of the synagogue for that answer. And so we kind of have the two choices. We have the parents who respond in fear, or we have the son who had seen Jesus, who had experienced Jesus, who had Jesus touch him and heal his broken eyes. And he says, I don't care what you do to me. I know Jesus to be true. So that brings me to this point, this sermon note. Children are going to call it as they see it. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it makes us as parents cringe. And the other parent's been in a cringe-worthy moment where your child says something, oh, I wish I hadn't said that. Children are going to call it as they see it. If they have seen God at work, they will worship. If they think worship is a farce, they're going to tell you that too. There's a whole generation of folks who, by and large, have left the church because they have not encountered God in worship. And they said, well, what's the point of this? I'm not going to spend my time sitting in a pew on Sunday morning. It's a beautiful day, right? If there's not something real about worship. When kids encounter God, that's the kind of worship that we all need to have. Because in those moments, we see what true, honest worship is about. I've got a book on my desk I'm reading right now called You Lost Me. It's about all the folks who have left church. And it's based on a lot of surveys they did asking questions, why did you leave church? Well, basically they say, yeah, church lost me. They weren't honest, they weren't real, there wasn't God. I didn't find God in that. And so, when kids do find God, and they do worship, it's something truly, truly that we need to encourage, we need to make happen. When we see it, we need to figure out, how do we follow them in this moment of worship? Kind of ties in with that is this note here. Children are authentic in their response to God without the concerns that shape how the rest of us act. And so, if you see a child who is celebrating, they're not at all worried about what's going on around them. My daughter in the grocery store is a perfect example of this. So she has a song in her head, and she's And as parents, sometimes we want to say, hey, snap out of it. But in other times, we say, hey, that is a beautiful thing. Because they are completely in that world. And if that world is a place of worship, it's something that I wish we could all get lost in that spot where we're not thinking about, well, I wonder what the person behind me thinks because I'm singing extra loud today because this song just really grabbed my heart. I hope we can get rid of some of that baggage and follow the kids around us a little more. There's a great story in 2 Samuel about King David. King David had left the ark. The ark was kind of the symbol of God's presence. And he'd left the ark with someone to take care of it. And then later on decided it's time to bring it to Jerusalem. And so there's this great scene of worship in 2 Samuel chapter 6 where David is dancing with all of his might before the ark of God. And it's a little unclear what's exactly going on, but apparently he wasn't wearing a whole lot of clothes. And he was spinning and dancing and he was jumping and he wasn't wearing a whole lot of clothes and maybe it wasn't quite a G-rated worship service. But it was this beautiful celebration. And they bring the ark into the tabernacle, the tent where they worship God. And eventually he dismisses everybody and sends them home. And he goes back to his house and his wife, Michal, comes to him and says, well, you just really embarrassed yourself today. Y'all have heard that? Yes. James has heard it. Anybody else have heard it? You really embarrassed me today. Yeah. And she said, in the eyes of the servant girls, you were so embarrassing. And David says, it wasn't for them. I wasn't dancing for them. But here's the reality, he says, I wasn't undignified in their eyes. They knew, they understood what I was doing. They understood that I was worshiping before God with all my might. So in their eyes, I'm going to be held in honor. That's what he says. Even if in your eyes, his wife's eyes, he was held in disregard. So there's something about that freedom in worshiping God that God loves. This is the sermon that we've probably read by now. David's undignified worship was pleasing to the children, but it was offensive to his dignified wife. Are we pleased or offended when someone celebrates before God? How do you all feel about that? And so if somebody got up in the middle of worship and was just singing at the top of their lungs and just had their hands out and they were doing something that you thought, boy, I've never been caught dead doing that. Would that make you smile? Would that make you think, boy, they need to go find a Pentecostal church? This is a Methodist church. We need to celebrate that. Now, I'm not expecting you all to twirl in your seats. My hope, though, is that you would let your heart express the depth of your worship to God. Whatever way that is. It may be sitting quietly. It may be twirling down the aisles. Just try not to hit anybody on the way by. So the question that I want us to think about today is this. What can we learn from children about how to worship? How can we get a piece of that carefreeness, that honesty? And how can we embrace that?